So what is biology? This class is biology. Biology is the study of life. So what does it mean to be alive? So when we're studying living things, it's important to know a couple of terms. First of all, non-living things are classified as being abiotic. When we put an A or an and in front of a word, that means non or not. And living things we call biotic factors. So when we're talking about living things, there are 7 characteristics that all living things have to possess, and we'll learn more about those shortly. So if we take a look at these pictures here, a plant would obviously be a biotic factor, it's living, and a rock would be abiotic. Now sometimes non-living things might have a few of the characteristics that living things do, but in order to be considered living, they have to have all of the characteristics of life. So what are the characteristics of life? So we're going to learn 7 characteristics, and a way that I have for you to remember them is Mr. Gore hates cheese. So I'd like you to list these in your notebook. You should have a space for 7 characteristics of life. So the first one is made of cells. Second, reproduce. So when organisms reproduce, they pass on their DNA. They also have to be able to grow and develop, obtain and use energy, respond to their environment, maintain homeostasis, and change over time. So let's look at the first characteristic, which is all living things are made of cells. So the cell is the most basic unit of life. Some organisms are made of one cell, some are made of many. But a couple things that this first characteristic presents to us is the cell theory. And the cell theory says that all living things are made of cells. All cells come from pre-existing cells. And you have to have at least one cell to be considered living. So as I said before, there are organisms that are unicellular and those that are multicellular. So uni means one, so unicellular organisms only have one cell, and all of their life activities are accomplished within that one cell. So some good common examples are bacteria, or an amoeba, which is a protist. Multi means many, so multicellular organisms such as ourselves have more than one cell. So what happens is the cells that make up a multicellular organism, they all have different tasks, but they work together for a common goal, which is to allow that organism to survive. So animals, such as ourselves, plants, are a good example of multicellular organisms. So here are some diagrams of some different single-celled organisms. We have some paramecium. We have some other types of protists here. Multicellular organisms, here are some different examples of specialized cells. So we have some red blood cells here. We have some cells that make up a plant. They look kind of like little bricks side by side. We have yeast cells, which we looked at in our demo that we did, Is It Alive or Not? They're a fungus. And then we also have some red blood cells, or I'm sorry, not some red blood cells. We have some, I believe down here I have some epithelial cells. Okay, so just to give you a couple other examples here, nerve cells, which make up our nervous system, bone cells, our reproductive cells, sperm and egg, different types of gland cells. So all these, if you notice, they have different shapes. So they have different structures that match their function. So 2 types of cells exist on Earth, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So what I would like you to write down is pro means before, and kary refers to the nucleus. So prokaryotic literally means that these are the cells that arose before there was a nucleus. So they're very simple, they don't have a nucleus. A perfect example is bacteria. U means true, so this means true nucleus. So these are going to be cells that are more complex. They have a nucleus, but they also have other membrane-bound organelles. So maybe you recall learning about things like the mitochondria, the Golgi apparatus, so things of that nature. So all the other kingdoms besides bacteria are going to include eukaryotic cells. So plants, animals, fungi, protists, they all have eukaryotic cells. So here's a side-by-side of a prokaryotic cell, like this bacterium here, and a eukaryotic cell. So as you can see, there's a big difference in size, But also, it's a little harder to see, but a difference in complexity. So we can see this eukaryotic cell has different organelles throughout it that the prokaryotic cell does not have. So now I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to do a little bit of practice here. So I'm going to pause, and this will be a good time for you to think about your answer, and then we'll fill it in. So up in the upper left-hand corner, I'm going to start here. This is an example of what kind of a cell? So is it a plant cell? Is it an animal cell? Could you tell? This is an animal cell. We can tell because it's round. It also doesn't have some of the organelles that plant cells have. This cell has a true nucleus, so it is a eukaryotic cell. All right, next I'm going to go to the upper right-hand corner here. This organism, now this one might be a little bit trickier for you, but this is a eukaryote. I know that because I see some organelles inside, like the nucleus. And it's unicellular, so it's just made of one cell. This actually happens to be an amoeba. All right, down in the bottom left-hand corner here, this organism, now you might be thinking it's a blowfish, but it's actually, I'm looking for what type of cells is it composed of. So it's a eukaryote, and it's multicellular. And then finally over here, this organism is a bacteria, but they are also known as prokaryotes because they're very simple and they don't possess membrane-bound organelles. So I want you to just stop and think, what kind of cells are humans comprised of? So the answer is we're made of eukaryotic cells. All of our cells have membrane-bound organelles that perform different functions within those cells. All right, next characteristic of life is reproduction. So although an organism doesn't need to reproduce over its lifetime for its individual survival, if reproduction doesn't happen within the species, then the population won't survive, okay? So the purpose of reproduction is to pass on our DNA, all right, which passes on our traits from parent to offspring. So there's a term that I want you to know called heredity, and heredity is just the passing of genetic material from parent to offspring, all right? So two types of reproduction. Reproduction called asexual reproduction is where one parent can simply either divide in two to create two offspring. So bacteria commonly are a good example of using this type of reproduction. So we have up here in the right-hand corner, we have one bacterial cell, and it copies its genetic material here, and then it divides in two. So we have two identical copies here. This is a hydra. The hydra uses something called budding, which is a type of asexual reproduction. It creates this little bud on here, which is essentially a new hydra. And what it does is it breaks off, and then we have an entirely new hydra plant. Some plants can reproduce asexually as well. Sexual reproduction is going to be reproduction with the help of two parents. So one parent's going to donate sperm. That would be the male parent. One's going to donate egg. That would be the female parent. When they come together, fertilization happens. It creates a new cell, which is the zygote, and that divides into the embryo and eventually results in a baby. So two parents is asexual, or I'm sorry, two parents is sexual reproduction. One parent is asexual reproduction. So before I move on to the next one, I just want to talk a little bit about what are some of the benefits of sexual versus asexual reproduction. So with sexual reproduction, we have more diversity in our offspring here, right? You and your siblings, if you have them, are probably very different from one another in your looks and your traits because both parents contributed DNA. But if we talk about asexual reproduction, the offspring are going to essentially look identical to the parent. All right, number 3 is grow and develop, okay? So instead of a turn and talk, because you're walking through this on your own, I just want you to stop and think for a minute. So what's the difference between this picture right here, picture 1, and picture 2? So in picture 1, we have a plant, and it kind of just looks like it's getting bigger. So we would define that as growth, something getting larger. But if we look at picture 2, we see a newborn, and while it's growing, we also have changes that are happening as we go from being an infant to an adolescent. And so that's termed development. So growth, you should know, is just a change in size, whereas development is a change in structure and function. So for example, if you think about a butterfly, as it grows, but it also develops. So we have those different stages from the caterpillar and to the pupa, and then eventually we get our butterfly. I'm missing a couple stages in there, but you've probably all seen a diagram of this before. And so we went from a caterpillar to a butterfly. So that's a lot of developmental changes. You've changed from an infant to an adolescent. Going through puberty, you have a lot of physical and chemical changes that are happening in your body, but you've also grown in size. You've gotten larger. So unicellular organisms are going to just mainly grow, whereas multicellular organisms, because they're made up of specialized cells, they'll develop as well. So the stages that an organism goes through its lifetime, where it grows and develops, is called the life cycle. So right down here I have a diagram of a mosquito life cycle. So we can see we have the eggs that develop into the larva, then into the pupa, and then the adult emerges from the water here, and we have the adult flying mosquito. All right, number 4 is all living things must obtain and use energy. So when we talk about energy, there's a term I want you to know, which is metabolism. Okay, so all living things have a metabolism, and sometimes when I talk about this with students, they tend to think of metabolism in terms of breaking down food. Maybe you've heard someone say like, oh, I can eat whatever I want because I have a really fast metabolism. While parts of that are true, your metabolism isn't just digesting your food, but it's all of the chemical reactions that happen inside your cells. So we talk about a plant cell, for example, they are going through photosynthesis, which is part of their metabolism. They're actually taking energy from the sun and converting it into food, which then they will also break down in their cells. So there are hundreds of thousands of millions of chemical reactions happening in your cells, and that's all part of your metabolism. So a couple terms I'd like you to know is that all living things are going to fit into one of these categories depending on how they obtain their energy. So they're either going to be producers, which we also call autotrophs. You also want to write down that they're called producers, like plants, for example. They get their energy from the sun. And then we also have heterotrophs, which are also called consumers. Okay, so they obtain energy by consuming things. So energy passes from one organism to the next as one's being eaten. You've probably seen a food chain before, but every living thing requires energy. It's just different how it gets it. So our producer down here is getting its energy from the sun, but then our grasshopper is getting energy from eating the plants, and our frog is getting energy from eating the grasshopper, and so on and so forth. Right, number 5, fifth characteristic of life is respond to the environment. All living things have to be able to respond in order to survive. So a good example of response to the environment, you guys think of whenever the bell rings, you know that it's time to get up and move to the next class. Now, while this might not be essential for your survival, another example of a response to your environment that is how your body reacts to changes in temperature. So this is kind of going to tie in with homeostasis, our next characteristic. Sometimes they go hand in hand. Another good example would be if you touch something hot, which we've all done before, our body responds by pulling away very quickly to the point that you don't even have to think about it. Your body just responds by pulling your arm away. So that's in an effort to save you from getting an injury. So a couple examples to think about. Well, first, I want to define a stimulus. So when I talk about these examples, a stimulus is any type of signal which an organism responds to. So think of things in the environment like light, sound, touch, a smell, okay? So think about your senses. So I want you to think about a couple examples here, and I'm going to have you pause and just write down your answers. So why don't you take a moment to do that? So when you leave a dark room, you go outside and you see the light. A lot of times you might have said you squint, okay? So, oops, we squint in response to that, okay? Our eyes are kind of trying to adjust to the light. Plants usually respond to sunlight as they usually grow towards it, okay? You can see this if you've ever put a plant in front of a window. Eventually, after a few days, the leaves will start to actually grow towards the light. What does a blowfish do when threatened by a predator? Well, I had a blowfish on a couple slides previous, but it essentially blows or like puffs itself out so that it can scare away the predator and keep itself safe. So this video here, I'll put it down in a separate link so you guys can watch it. But it's kind of cool. This is called the light sensitive plant, or the touch sensitive plant. And what it does is anytime you touch it, it responds really quickly. And it's kind of a cool example of response to a stimulus. All right, I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes here. I'd like you to pause, and I want you to take a minute to answer these 5 scenarios. So you're going to look at the underlined term. Okay, so I've underlined terms on my slides. They're not necessarily underlined in your packet, so you should underline these in your packet, and I want you to determine, do you think this is a stimulus or a response? So go ahead and pause the video now, and when you're done, you can check your answers. All right, so let's take a look. Shark swims towards the direction of a smell of blood. The shark swimming would be a response, all right? The smell of blood would be the stimulus, okay? But we're focusing on what's underlined. A human blushes due to an embarrassing comment. That would be a response. The stimulus would be the embarrassing comment. A bat hears flapping wings of an insect. The flapping wings of an insect is the stimulus. Okay, so he hears it. We don't exactly know what the response is, but maybe he's going to go and eat the insect. Person jerks their hand away from a hot stove. That's a response. The heat on the stove is the stimulus. And a dog chases a running rabbit would be the response. The stimulus would have been the rabbit, which might be a prey for it, chasing it. All right, almost done here. 2 more. So number 6, characteristic of life is maintaining homeostasis. So homeo, I want you to know that word means the same, and stasis refers to stable. So homeostasis literally means maintaining a stable environment. All right. So all living things have to be able to do this, whether you're unicellular or multicellular. And so a good example to think about is when you go outside. This week it's been extremely hot. When you go out, it might be feeling like 100 degrees outside, but your internal body temperature will stay relatively the same. But what you will notice happening is that you start to sweat, and that's all done in an effort to cool yourself down. Now, you don't even have to think about this. Sweating just happens on its own, and that's because inside your body you basically have a little bit of a thermostat like you might have in your house. So we can make an analogy there, but what happens is you start to sweat, your heat evaporates from your skin, and then you start to cool down. Again, I'll put this little video in a link below. Okay, so let's give a couple examples here for maintaining homeostasis. Here's the temperature one that I just went over, but when it's cold, you shiver. When it's hot, you sweat. And the reason is to keep our internal body temperature at about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? So when it's cold, your muscles start to contract and relax really quickly. And again, you don't have to think about this, but it's in an effort to keep your body temperature at about 98.6. Here's just a little diagram that I have to show you the loop of how our body actually keeps our temperature where it should be. So body temperature gets too hot, we do what is needed to lower it, which is sweating. Body temperature gets too cold, we start to shiver to bring it back up. A couple other examples you can write down are we regulate our blood sugar levels. So you might think of someone who's diabetic. They don't have the ability to do that, so they might have to take insulin. But our body should do this normally. So when we eat a meal with lots of sugar, what it'll do is it'll store that excess sugar away so it doesn't affect us negatively. Also, regulation of water balance. When you drink lots of fluids, you usually have to urinate. So that's our body's way of releasing any excess water. Also, whenever we don't have enough fluids, we feel thirsty. So that's our body's way of telling us that we need to take in more water to maintain homeostasis. All right, guys, last one. This is evolutionary adaptation. So this was the cheese, right, which is change over time. Now, I have a diagram here, and I want to see if you can tell if there are living things shown here. So maybe you can see a little outline here. This is a pygmy seahorse, okay? Very, very small, but they blend in with coral. And then this is a toad here who's blending in with some tree bark and rocks here. So let's define what an adaptation is. And an adaptation is any type of characteristic or trait that just allows an organism to survive and reproduce better in its environment. So something to keep in mind here when we're talking about change over time, individual organisms, I'm not talking about an individual organism changing, but I'm talking about a group of individuals or a species, a population of species changing over time. So this is all based on the environment. So let's say that it's an advantage for organisms to have thicker coats of fur, and the ones that don't die off, the ones that do survive. And so if we're talking about a population of bears, over time we might see that population change so that most bears have thicker coats of fur. So it's not that an individual organism is going to change over time, but to be a living thing, we know that change happens over time to populations of a particular species, okay? And it's even happened within our own. So the last example I want to finish up with here is Darwin. If you've ever studied him, his finches that he studied, he noted that different species of finch had different shapes of beaks, and that was a result of changes that happened over time due to those populations. And so that is our last characteristic of life. If you missed anything, please go ahead on back and pause and rewatch to help you understand these 7 characteristics.